Good morning, everyone. That was, we need more people here. And I look forward to having more people here so we can sing songs like that. It's always sweet when a little kid sings a song, knows the words, but maybe doesn't hit the notes exactly how you want them to. And I hope God looks down on us in the same way, like they're trying under the circumstances that they have. We don't have all our strongest singers here, but we try our hardest, and we sing, and we're making melody in our hearts. And that's what counts. And so thank you for leading that song, because I love that song. I really do. I want to start off by reading in 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1. And we're going to start in verse 13. Verse 13. Therefore, preparing your minds for action, and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last time for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. The last sermon that I did on a Sunday morning, I didn't mention it, but I plan on doing a series, a short series here on this, first couple chapters of 1 Peter, because it's all about being born again. And so the last sermon, we talked about how we are born again and what a blessing that is, that we have been given this fresh start. We've been born again to a greater hope, a greater faith, and yes, a greater outcome than anything that this world could ever offer us. And this morning I want to continue this thought in Peter and talk about what are the implications of being born again, born to a greater hope, born to a greater faith, born to a greater outcome. But before I do that, I just want to ask you all, so you can think about it in your mind, what kind of person are you? This is by no means an exhaustive list of the types of people out there, but are you the type of person that is just non-committal, kind of just outright fickle? We struggle sometimes at committing to anything, no matter what anything may be. Are you the type of person that maybe is kind of riding the fence, where you make a lot of goals up in your mind, but sometimes you commit, sometimes you don't? You kind of put in half as much effort as what you know you should. Or, going to the opposite end of the spectrum, are you a total type A personality, putting your absolute every effort into whatever your focus may be? In fact, you have such laser focus that you tune out everything else. Everything else becomes peripheral, and you just have your sights and your vision and your efforts set on one thing in your life. Which type of person are you? It's really interesting when we think about Christianity and we talk about Christianity, because we're all being molded into the image of his Son. Let me click this so that my PowerPoint doesn't stop. But we're all being molded into the image of Christ. We're all trying to follow his example, and yet Christianity looks a little bit different on every individual that's following Christ, doesn't it? We all have various personalities. We all have strengths and weaknesses. But Peter makes it really clear in this passage, starting in verse 13, that we have to overcome some of our weaknesses. We have to overcome some things that might be ingrained in our personality. Because too often we just make that an excuse, don't we? Where there's some shortcoming in our lives, but we say, that's just who I am. But we can't afford to settle for that as Christians. Because there are some areas where we have to be totally committed. We can't be afraid of commitment. There are some areas where we can't just ride the fence in life. But we have to get off the fence and make a decision, don't we? There are some areas where our laser focus may be useful, but only if we're focused on the right things. To be born again is a new start. It's a new start, it's a fresh start, but it doesn't just end there. It's not just a new start. To be born again is also an opportunity to be all in, an opportunity to be all in the right areas, to have something worth dedicating everything that you have to it. That's what being born again is all about. And so as I read this text, there are some areas we need to be all in. And I want to talk about two of them. We have to, first of all, be all in hoping in Him. Isn't that what Peter says? He says, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Set your hope fully on the grace that is to be revealed. When we talk about investing all of our hope in that salvation that we have and that grace that will be revealed when Jesus comes back again, we have to understand that there are some things that we have to work on first. First things first. Whenever you go all in on anything, whenever you commit to something, whenever you decide you're going to give something everything you have, there's some preparation that goes on into that, isn't there? Whatever that thing may be. In fact, you'd be foolish to invest everything you have in something without preparing first. It's no different in the spiritual life, in walking in faith with Jesus. Peter tells us, preparing your minds for action. Invest your hope fully in that grace that is to be revealed. That idea of preparing our minds, you could literally translate it to gird up the loins of your mind. That might sound kind of weird, but back in Israel's day, they didn't all walk around wearing Levi blue jeans, right? They wore robes and they wore things that were difficult to run in. And so for an Israelite, when they were getting ready for action, when they were getting ready for hard work, when they were running into the face of an enemy, they would gird up their loins. They would tuck in their cloth. They would get everything out of the way so that they were free to go all in. In order to really go all in on hope, and in order to experience joy and rest in the confident expectation we have, we first got to get some things out of the way, don't we? There's a lot of things that we could call maybe hope killers in this life, couldn't we? Maybe you can think of some things that have killed your hope in life. Sin is probably the first one, isn't it? I mean, we fall into this pattern of sin in our lives, and it's like the light in our life is slowly being choked out. And we go on this downward spiral, and we become what Paul calls a slave to sin. That's a state where we have no hope. Sometimes what kills our hope is getting caught up in the past, what life used to be, or what life could have been had I done things differently, or had things worked out differently. Sometimes it's a matter of daydreaming, having our head in the clouds, constantly dreaming about what the future might hold rather than focusing on what's currently going on right in front of me in the moment, not appreciating what's already been done for me. I think what those last two things really have in common is this desire to constantly want to escape reality. I kind of find myself struggling with that sometimes, and I joke with Jack that lately I've been playing video games because I just got to take out my frustration on something because of everything going on in the world, and I hardly ever play video games, but lately I've just been drawn to that, to escape what's going on in the world. It's a desire to escape reality. But Peter tells us to prepare our minds. He tells us to be sober-minded. And it's interesting when you think about it, the reality is without God, we already know what Peter has told us and is telling us. Without God, there is no hope. And we're confronted with that all the time because we see a world without God, don't we? And we sometimes forget that we're living a life with God. We imagine the world being without God sometimes, and we lose hope, don't we? And we feel that. But again, Peter, he says to prepare our minds, but to be sober-minded as well. As one person put it, drunken stupor is the refuge of those who have no hope. You know, sober-minded doesn't mean just that we don't drink, that we don't get drunk on wine or whatever the substance may be. It means you're in control of your mind. You look up the Greek word, it means to be mentally well-balanced. That you control your thoughts don't control you. It's as Paul put it in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 5. He says, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. That is a sober-minded, prepared mind. That whatever enters my head, however depressing it may be or however hopeless the thought may seem, I'm able to take that captive and make it obedient to Christ. And focus on that hope that we have. That's why we're preparing our minds. That's why we're sober-minded, so we can focus on the hope, so we can focus on the true spiritual reality in front of us, that we have hope worth investing everything into. And of course, what hope is that? We talked about that great hope we have, but the foundation of that eternal life is that grace that's going to be revealed through Jesus Christ. It's salvation, that this world isn't my home. We're told to set our hope fully on it. That's a really interesting sentence that Peter says, to set your hope fully on the grace that is to come, because it actually flies in the face of all three of those personalities we were talking about earlier, doesn't it? I mean, for the people that don't commit at all, or the people that ride the fence, Peter says you got to commit fully, right? There's no excuse for being fickle here, for riding the fence. You have to make a decision. You have to be fully committed. You have to have your hope fully set on salvation in this life. But it also challenges that type A personality as well, that person that's laser focused so that he can focus on one thing and everything else becomes peripheral. I think that's an amazing gift if you are that type of person. But it can also be a great weakness. Because if I'm putting my strengths and I'm putting all my focus on one thing, how much left over do I have for God? At the end of the day, I use this example whenever I talk about this passage. We need what I'm going to call a non-diversified hope. But you think about Dave Ramsey, and I was hoping Kevin Davidson would be here today because I was going to ask, there's one word that this guy repeats over and over when it comes to investing your money. And he'll say it 3 times in a row normally when I've heard him say it. But that is diversify, 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 right? Diversify. We put a lot of hope in our money, don't we? That's going to be the difference between, happiness and depression and fulfillment and unfulfillment in this life, is sometimes how we look at money. And since we put so much hope in money, that means that we put our hope in the entities that promise us money, don't we? And for a lot of us, that's simply our job, but also it's the stock market, which has been, it kind of goes back and forth. It's been letting us down, and then it's giving us hope. But in terms of the world, what Peter says in verse 13 really flies in the face of what we're told, doesn't it? Again, when it comes to investments, Dave Ramsey says diversify, diversify, diversify. And that's great advice for money, if we've listened to Dave Ramsey, because we know that there's a chance that that sure thing, that sure investment that I should put all my eggs into, there's a chance that that sure thing doesn't work out. And so we diversify our funds. All we need to look at is Enron, right? How many people remember Enron? Yeah. Research that one. And in 2000, the stock was worth $90 a share, and by the end of 2001, it was worth less than $1 a share. Things can change dramatically, can't they? And again, it's great financial advice to diversify because it's safer. You can rest easier. There's no risk, no sacrifice, no hard decisions are made. Great money advice, but it's terrible spiritual advice. But that's precisely sometimes what we do. We diversify our hope in all aspects of life, and I'm afraid that sometimes it influences where we place our spiritual hope. I mean, we start young having big dreams, don't we? I'm going to be an astronaut or an NBA player, or whatever that crazy dream may be, but we also eventually wise up and we have a backup plan in case that doesn't work out, right? Thank goodness for that. Or how about instead of waiting to date the right person, I settle for somebody instead of waiting for Mr. Right, and I say, well, I'll settle for this person in case Mr. Right doesn't come along. We do it in harmless ways, but we do it in serious ways as well. And the question again that I have is, do we do that spiritually? Do we diversify our hope spiritually? I'm afraid that we do. You may recall or may not recall Amaziah, one of the kings of Israel. And God extended so much grace to Amaziah. And it's really interesting. You remember when we study Kings or when you study Chronicles, whenever it introduces a king, or sometimes at the end of their life, it gives this evaluation of that person. And of him it says that he followed God, but not with his whole heart. That person that rides the fence, right? And God extended so much grace to Amaziah, because Amaziah was getting ready to go out and fight against the Edomites. And he got all these men from Judah. He got 300,000 men, but then he also said, I'm going to hire 100,000 men from Israel to help me. And Israel was not doing what they should have been doing during that time. And so God sends a prophet to intercede, and he tells Amaziah, do not bring those 100,000 men of Israel with you, because if you do, God's not with them. It won't work out. Amaziah is apprehensive, but he listens to the prophet. He goes to battle against Edom, and guess what happens? He wins. They kill 10,000, take another 10,000 captive. And that's what makes his next move so shocking. He followed God, but not with his whole heart. And after the battle, Amaziah came from striking down the Edomites. He brought the gods of the men of Seir and set them up as his gods, and worshiped them, making offerings to them. Is that a man that diversified his hope? I'm just going to worship whatever gods I get my hands on and see which one pans out. The prophet told him, why are you worshiping gods that couldn't even deliver their own people? He's diversifying his hope. I think the problem with us sometimes is when we talk about setting our hope fully on that grace that's to be revealed, that salvation that's waiting for us on the other side of this life or when Jesus comes back, whichever comes first. I think the problem is that we haven't made that our goal, but we've made it our safety net. I was talking to somebody yesterday about how sometimes somebody asks, hey, why are you a Christian? And how do you actually believe that stuff? And sometimes people respond, hey, if you're wrong, that means you're going to hell. And if I'm wrong, hey, I'm just dead in the ground, right? We've heard that argument before. That's not what God's looking for. He's not looking for somebody that's in this just in case. Because just in case isn't going to allow us to be all in. He's not looking for somebody to make a safety net out of him. He's looking for somebody that's going to give him everything that he has, that forsakes the safety net, that's willing to sacrifice whatever worldly thing attracts him in this life. And so many of us, when we don't focus our hope fully on the salvation that's to come, we find ourselves in the same situation that Jeremiah describes to Israel. Be appalled, O heaven, at this. Be shocked, be utterly desolate, declares the Lord, for my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. All the cistern is basically a well that's dug into the ground. And sometimes what would happen is the mortar that was plastered up against the walls, the foundation of it would begin to crack and the water would begin to leak out, or sometimes the water would dry up. And he uses this to describe the spiritual condition of Israel. They made their own cisterns when they could have had living waters and never-ending supply. Life is full of potential cisterns, isn't it? And we spend our lives digging hole after hole after hole. And we see every single one, eventually it dries up, doesn't it? We can't spend our lives building wells and cisterns. We need to spend our life turning to the life-giving spring that will cause water to well up inside of us unto eternal life, is what Jesus says to the woman by the well. That's what we have. It's a sure thing. It's a thing that will cause us to be fulfilled. It's something that we can rely on even during the worst times in our lives. It's that life-giving water. And so go all in. Be dedicated to that hope. Hope fully in him. And furthermore, go all in on being his child, being his children. As Peter goes on to say, he says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. I love how the topic of obedience hasn't arisen until just now. I mean, think of all the things that Peter has discussed in the opening sections of this book. He's talked about a better faith, a better hope, a greater outcome, salvation. He established the reality that as Christians, we have been born again. And finally, he gets to verses 13 through 15. And he begins to talk about obedience. There is a place for obedience, a big place for obedience in the Christian's life, right? We have to be obedient as children of God. But we can't ignore how Peter brings that up. It's important how he brings it up. He doesn't say be obedient so you can get to heaven or be obedient so that you can be reborn potentially, although that's how many of us have been taught. Rather, he says we already have been reborn. You've been born again. It's an opportunity to serve him. Don't give up. That's the only thing that will prevent us from going to heaven, is if we give up. We've been born again. Of course, that begs the question, reborn to whom? A new birth means a new master, doesn't it? The reason we're to be obedient is not so that we can be reborn, but it's because we are reborn. It's a big difference. And obedience is so important because a child's behavior, right or wrong, reflects their parents, doesn't it? But also a child sometimes just naturally in some ways is going to resemble his parents. It's interesting, you watch families, and when they adopt children, it doesn't matter about the biological difference. That child grows up and his mannerisms, the way they act, they imitate the family that they are a part of. We need to remember that when we wear the name Christian, our behavior is going to reflect on God. And if we are a bad reflection of him, we'll be judged for that. I think that's partly why he says what he does in verse 17. And if you call on him as Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. If you call on him as Father, you better mean it. He's my Father, and I listen to him and no others. The problem is we're often tempted to reflect the person we were before we came to Christ. Or sometimes we're tempted to reflect some pattern that already exists in this world. And what we're doing is we're still conforming to our former passions, aren't we? And that idea to conform is to form according to a pattern or a mold. And what we have to do is we got to break that mold. We got to break that mold of behavior that has been a part of us for so long. It's interesting when you look at Leviticus 18, 3 through 4, God told his people, look, you're not to behave and you're not to follow the statutes of Egypt and you're not to follow the statutes of Canaan, but you're going to follow my statutes, what I say. Because in the end, that's the only thing that's going to break the mold. And so when we become a Christian, there's some things that ought to change. We ought to notice a difference in our life and in each other's lives from before I was a Christian to now after being a Christian and becoming a Christian. I thought about some things such as speech. The way that we talk can make a big difference. Realize what's being said here. He says, be holy in all your conduct. Everything you do. That starts sometimes with the way we talk, the words we choose. One of the big ones that you see when somebody becomes a Christian is they say God's name in vain. They say, oh my God. That's something that ought to change as we realize how big a deal it is to call upon God. That's not just something that we throw around casually. Or how about how we spend our free time? Or what we do when nobody's watching? Or the places that we go, or the websites that we spend time scrolling on. All these are ways that we can be holy in all our conduct. That means every aspect of your life, you're striving for holiness. But you look at that statement that's made. He says, be holy as I am holy. And that has to be sometimes for me the most disheartening sentence I've ever read. To be holy as God is holy. To be all in as his child means that I'm totally committed to holiness, no matter what time of day, no matter who I am around. Again, Peter says, be holy in all your conduct. And that task, of course, it's impossible without the Lord's help, isn't it? We can't do it on our own, but there is a sweet simplicity to what's being said as well. We're to model our holiness after God, and ultimately after his Son, who is the exact imprint of God, it says in Hebrews 1. We can see why we're called his children and why we are referred to as that. Because we're to be imitators of Christ and imitators of God, as a child imitates his father. I want to be just like you someday. The problem with Israel is they were no longer imitating their God, but were modeling themselves after their forefathers, their traditions, their religious practices. Peter wrote through the Spirit, you were ransomed from the futile ways of your forefathers. They became part of this mold. And what God wanted was for them to break that mold. But I love what he says. He says, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of this exile or this sojourn, depending on the the text. But that's this idea of being a stranger without citizenship. At the end of the day, when we model ourselves after Christ, when we're striving to be holy in all our conduct, we understand he's going to make up for our failures. But what you'll see in the end is somebody that's a foreigner. Somebody that says, this world is not my home. Somebody that's looking forward to a new home. It's really interesting because we can all spot a foreigner from a mile away, can't we? Who is that up there? That's Jack Hafer. You can spot a foreigner from a mile away, can't you? You can tell by the way that they dress, by the way that they act. They're so impressed with everything around them. They act completely different than people that are from that area, don't they? That's what we're called to be. In a world where everybody's doing the same thing, in a world where everybody's following each other, in a world where they're following just the feudal way of their forefathers, we're called to break that mold, to renounce our worldly citizenship and say, I'm a citizen of heaven. I follow heaven's rules. We're exiles. And maybe that's what God's trying to get us to see with all these problems springing up in life right now. Like we just see problem after problem after problem, and we say, I don't want to be here forever. And I'm sure as an exile in Israel's day, as you had Christians going out into foreign areas and Jews that were dispersed in that day, I'm sure there was a million things that they could have feared in those days. People persecuting them, ostracizing them. But Peter tells us as exiles, we are to fear one. And that would be our God, who is both our Father and our Judge and the ruler of heaven and earth. He's our master, and he dwells in our eternal home. And that's what we're striving for. And the only reason we have that opportunity, the opportunity to be all in, is because he sent his Son to do it first. And so at the end of the day, we need to be all in like him. Verses 18 through 20 say, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. He was foreknown before the foundations of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. They were all in when you talk about Christ and the Father. He was willing to send his Son, and Jesus was willing to die for us. He forsook worldly desires. He wasn't married. He didn't have a family. For 3 years, he told people about how he was the Messiah. And they killed him. We need to be all in like him. Was he holy? Yes. Was he in exile? Yes, as he left heaven to dwell on earth. Was he obedient as a child of God to the point of death, wasn't he? Was he all in? Yes. And he did it, why? So that our faith and hope are in God. We spend a lot of time and energy on things that, in the end, sometimes don't cultivate and don't add up to anything. And we've all felt the disappointment of that before, haven't we? Where we invest in something, or we spend all of our time on a project. Maybe you pursued a degree and you're not using that degree and you're saying, why did I spend so much time and energy on that? Peter tells us to go all in, to be holy in all our conduct, to invest our hope fully in him. Because it's the one thing in this life that we can look back and say, it was worth it. So don't hold back. Go all in. And if you're somebody that's here this morning and you feel you've been holding back and you want to recommit, or you have any spiritual need at all at this time, please come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation.